Good afternoon and welcome to our 5th MFL webinar for British schools in the Middle East. My name is Claire Barclay-Trinnaman and I am the head of MFL at Park House English School here in Doha, Qatar. Today's webinar is entitled Teaching Target Language Phonics, and we are delighted to welcome our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Krista Hazel, who is an MFL teacher, leader, author, blogger and education consultant. She works internationally with schools to develop innovative and impactful teaching and learning strategies from over 20 years' experience in UK schools. She is a published author, independent thinking associate, SLE in MFL, a National Council member for the Association for Language Learning, and is a mental health first aider. Krista will discuss how the impact of teaching target language phonics is instrumental in developing oracy, reading and writing, as well as confidence and competence in the drive for excellence in the languages classroom. For our second contribution, Mikhail Jamin will speak on behalf of Dubai English Speaking School and will focus on the use of phonics training in French and English phonics in Arabic to accelerate language learning acquisition. Mikhail holds a PhD in linguistics and after an academic career in several universities, decided to retrain as a primary school teacher in 2006. He taught in various primary schools in the UK before moving to Dubai in 2010. He became the head of department at Dubai English Speaking School and is particularly interested in the natural approach to language learning. Please share your questions and your comments on the MFL network page today in the Ask a Question tab, stating which of our two speakers you would like to answer your question. Any questions uploaded today will be sent to our speakers and I will post their responses in the Ask a Question forum for you as soon as possible. So we'll first of all hear from Krista and then from Mikhail. Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, and thank you to everyone at the British Schools in the Middle East for inviting me to do this webinar today. My name is Krista Hazel and I hope that you enjoy this session. So I've been teaching for over 20 years and hopefully some of my experience that I'll share with you today will help you, and I am author of this book which is available now. So I'm here today to speak to you about target language phonics, and for me the impact of teaching target language phonics is instrumental in developing oracy, reading, writing, as well as confidence and competence in the drive for excellence in the languages classroom. So I'd like to ask you first of all, if you don't mind, and you might want to stop the video once I've asked you this question, to just stop, pause and consider for a moment. What's your favourite foreign language word? Or what's your favourite international language word? So this isn't in your mother tongue, this is in the other tongues that you speak. Now, you might be a polyglot, therefore you can have one word per language that you speak. So feel free to just pause and think for a moment and consider what your favourite word within that language might be. So welcome back if you've just paused, and if you've carried on, great. You might want to have made a note of your favourite foreign language words. My favourite foreign language words, in French it's Quincaillerie, I just love it. In German it's Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, and in Russian it's Zdravstvuyte. And I just love those three words. There are other words that I love, but I just absolutely love those three words. Now I collect these, so I'm quite happy for you to tweet those or collect those and email those to me, because I do collect people's favourite words. I find them really interesting. And what I'd like to ask you to consider now is, why is it your favourite word? So is it, for example, the way you say it? Is it because perhaps it's a special memory? And about 70% of people that I've asked, whether in conferences, at events, in my classroom, I've asked them, why is it your favourite word? And they say to me, it's the way you say it. They absolutely love the way it just rolls off the tongue. About 20% of people say there's a special memory linked to that word. Perhaps it's a holiday destination, or when something, they learned that word, or they bought that thing on holiday, or perhaps it's a food type. And 10% just say, I really love that word, Krista. And I'm like, okay then, but why do you really love that word? And they tell me it's often because of the way it sounds. So just out of interest, how did you learn to say your favourite word? And I guess the question is, of course, which is why we're here today, is do you teach target language phonics in your classroom, in your departments, within your school? Now, were you taught phonics, yes or no? And I'm of the age where actually I wasn't taught phonics in school in my mother tongue, or indeed my other tongues either. But I think there's research recently that's been appearing over the last decades really to say that it's as important as teaching students how to listen, read, write, and obviously speak in the target or the international language. So if you do teach it, what's your reasoning for it? And again, you might want to just pause the video, just stop for a moment and just jot down some ideas or discuss within your department, what's your reason for it? And if you don't teach it, what's your reason for that too? And again, there's no judgment here. Please don't think there is. So I learnt my favourite words. And if I think back to my favourite words, I learnt those through repetition, through my teacher breaking them down so I could break down the sounds and actually could then blend those sounds together and actually say the words correctly. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have been able to say quincaillerie. I would have said something with a mother tongue influence first. So my mother tongue is English, so I would have used that first. That's just automatic with our learners. They often, when they're reading something in the international language, they revert to their mother tongue rather than the language that they're learning. Some, with support and with guidance, try to move beyond that and try to say something in a French or a German or an Italian or a Russian way, but they really do need to be taught that. So you might want to just again think about, do you teach the sound spelling link? And perhaps you're sort of teaching phonics by just breaking words down through those repetition items. It's quite a new element of language teaching and research, if you like. Some people say, I think it's been around for quite a while now, but some people say it's vital, and I absolutely agree with that. So just pause for a moment, again, in your departments and just consider, you know, what do you think about phonics? What do you know already? What do you know? And this is over the coming slides that I'm going to share with you and the remaining time that we have left. So what level of thinking is required from you in this session? And ultimately, you're going to be with me for 30 minutes. So what actually are you going to take away from today and what are you going to do with it? And again, you may wish to just pause the video to just really get the most out of this session. So why teach phonics, or certainly target language phonics? Well, I believe that the grapheme phoneme link and that understanding is essential to building confidence in the languages classroom. I've been a languages teacher for quite a long time now, well over 20 years. And one of the things that I think when I think back to my early years teaching and certainly my latter years teaching, it's something that I know that I've introduced to my students and they've really benefited from. And certainly it's been essential to build their confidence. And if you've taught in a UK school or indeed refer to the Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3 framework, teaching both of these frameworks do indicate that actually teaching languages, whether it's in primary or indeed in secondary, should enable pupils to understand and communicate using their knowledge of phonology, to develop accurate pronunciation and intonation so that others understand when they're reading aloud or using familiar words and phrases, as well as to explore patterns and sounds of language, link spelling, sounds and meanings of words. And again, at Key Stage 3, to transcribe words and short sentences that they can hear with increasing accuracy and speak coherently and confidently with increasing pronunciation, increasingly accurate pronunciation and intonation. And of course, this is very important for communication purposes and intrigue and interest. Nobody wants to hear somebody speaking an international language with a very heavy mother tongue influence. And I'm fairly certain that actually if we don't teach them how to match the sound and spelling links together, you know, there's grapheme phoneme liaisons. If we don't give them that, then they'll really struggle. And Erla in 2003, as well as many others actually, have stated that they will revert to their mother tongue. So that heavy influence. So I would have spoken French or German when I was learning it, had I not been taught and not been encouraged that, probably with a heavy English accent. And certainly in times of stress, we almost definitely revert to our mother tongue because it feels safe, even though we don't necessarily realise that. And obviously this is really unhelpful in the languages classroom. Accents are incorrect, and students, the young people in our classes know when they sound wrong and know when it doesn't sound right. So they get very anxious, they start to withdraw, and actually we want to really empower them in the classroom so that they feel really confident and that they can speak and that they can do well. That's what we want to do in the languages classroom. So I would say teach them phonics. So the impact of not teaching target language phonics is right here, really, and this is evidenced by War, Erler, Macaro and Graham in different studies across the last 10 to 15 years. So all because learners can't decode the language with a degree of confidence. So their language learning is disturbed a little bit, they develop that negativity, we know that some students feel anxious, and they definitely don't want to feel stupid in our classrooms, because that's when the negativity creeps in and they start to disengage. So we want to avoid that. So how are you going to teach target language phonics, then, you might be thinking? So I would say teach it so they know it and they can apply it. So definitely teach it explicitly. Be absolutely crystal clear what you're teaching, why you're teaching it. If this was a subject, if this was a theme, if this was new vocabulary, you would absolutely do that. So teach it explicitly, teach it sequentially as well, and robustly, because ultimately we want students to be able to, once they've been taught it, to draw upon it, call upon it, and use it in future language lessons. And actually, because it is the target language phonics that we're focusing on, it's that increase and improvement in pronunciation and intonation within their speech that will be very, very clear. So we want that to be robustly taught so they can speak with increasing degrees of confidence and competence. So you can't teach all 26 or 26 French sounds, 29 German sounds, 39 Spanish sounds. You can't teach them all in one go. We have to break it down. So you may choose one sound to start off with, and then a week later do another. Now it's entirely up to you when you do it, but what I would say to you is do think about Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, and absolutely do create opportunities for this to be interwoven through schemes of learning through the term. So actually students don't just learn this in isolation. It's robustly taught and is sequential, so something will have come before it and something will come after it, but they are expected to repeatedly retrieve it and use it through a range of not only resources but also through a range of skills, so listening, speaking, reading, writing. So so I would say teach it through all of the skills, and I'm actually going to talk to you now about some of the things that I've done, that I know the students that I've taught, and also the schools that I work with as an SLE in MFL, and how they can integrate just a few ideas to ensure that actually it's not just a one-stop shop. They do teach target language phonics through all of these mediums. I think that learning is not fleeting, it remains. It's not like writing in the sand and one day it's there, one day it's gone. We want it to remain because we want students to keep hold of this knowledge, apply this when they are reading aloud, when they are speaking the international language. I think that's important. So whatever activities you choose, that of course is entirely up to you, what you choose to do, because you know your learners best. You know what engages them, you know what excites them, you also know what overexcites them too, and also what resources you have within your school right now. And certainly if you've stopped previously and had a little think about what you do within your department or within your classroom, you'll be aware of the resources, or somebody might have said, oh, there are these resources too that you might not be aware of. So we need to make sure that they absolutely learn these phonic sounds, and I'm going to talk to you now about a few ways that you can include this across these skills here. So if we're looking at listening activities, then we want to make sure that this is part of the lesson. It's not something that we force in. And actually we do gap fill and close tasks. Of course we do. Students are listening out for specific information. Or what we could do is actually break that down, so students are tasked with listening for a missing phoneme, and that really, really does focus the ears and really helps them to identify that sound. Dictation obviously is a really wonderful thing. It's back in the classroom. It's very much de rigueur, and lots of us have been using it. Running dictation, some people like to do as well. And those are really, really nice things to be able to, once you've taught target language phonics, then you can absolutely just do those dictations with those learners. Now I'm just going to zip back up one because I did miss out classify then. And if you give students like a list of words, you could give them words like a poisson, trois, croissant, beau, au, cadeau, and ask them to classify them in terms of the phoneme sounds that they hear, just within a simple grid. And it's something very easy but very powerful. Noughts and crosses as well. It's a game, it's the gamification, if you like, of target language phonics, and you can just put the sounds across and students can play the game just by correctly identifying those sounds, but also perhaps retrieving a little bit more by identifying words, common words that they've used. For reading activity, how often do you encourage your learners to read and follow the text that you're reading aloud to them? I do. It's something that I've done for a number of years. Students don't always like to, they tend to look around the room, like to, do different things, but I want them to follow the text. So I get them to get a ruler or get a pen or pencil and just follow. So I know that they are actually looking at the text. So when they hear what I'm saying, they can identify that with the words. I obviously use punctuation as well to really help them with that. They find this really interesting, and actually often when learners learn to read in their mother tongue, then actually they use their finger to go along the words. And the ruler is just a very simple way, but it also helps students to keep the lines they're meant to be on rather than being at different points in the text. And we always know that there's maybe one or two learners that try to do that. So having them and making sure that they've got a ruler, or indeed another page from a separate book, not the same book or text, then they can just use that. Get them to read aloud too. And I think this is really, really powerful, getting them to read aloud, because actually it's really nice for them to be able to practice doing that. Now, we can't spend our times as teachers with 30 plus learners within our class listening to every single one, but it's quite a nice thing to be able to do and just get them to identify a few different phoneme sounds, for example, or if you're reading aloud, get them to underline a particular sound. So if we're looking at French phonemes, for example, it could be the wa sound, or it could be the o sound, it could be the on sound. It's entirely up to you, but you're then making sure that they're not just learning those phonic sounds, they're actually applying that knowledge as well. And it just helps demystify it a little bit. Now, obviously, if you've got a list of words, you can play snap games with them where students say things, so they have to identify different sounds together. So if I say quoi, they have to think of another word that either goes with it or perhaps is different. And that's just, again, a really fun game. And students tend to try to make up words. So a fairly extensive knowledge of vocabulary is required for that one, but it is quite a nice game to play. Rhubarbe is a brilliant game that actually came from a primary school teacher who shared that with me, and it's just such a wonderful game. Students absolutely love it, and it's a wonderful start to the lesson where I give a target language text to the learners, read it aloud, they follow, they can make notes if they want to, but then when they're back in class, I give them a new sheet, and they only have to read a sentence each. Well, that sounds very simple, just reading one sentence. You're probably thinking, oh, Krista, that's a bit tedious. But actually, I issue the text, so it doesn't have any sound, doesn't have any markings on it, and students have to read their one sentence. The rest of the class have to listen and listen aloud. And if that learner makes a mistake when they're reading, so I may start the first sentence, and obviously they will have had time to practice this, whether it's at home, homework, they've had time to read it and practice those sounds. So I'll do the first sentence and then somebody else goes on. When that somebody else goes on, if they make a mistake, then a student will put their hand up and just shout rhubarbe. Now they decided on that word and it's just kind of stuck. Other learners pick different words, and it's entirely up to you what word you use, but then those learners that identified an issue then have to correct that learner. So then another person, the next person, reads that sentence again. Now it should be straightforward because they should pick it up, but you would be surprised how focused they have to be in terms of listening to one another, and also making sure that they apply the grapheme phoneme links. It's really, really great fun, really good fun. You could do it for 5 minutes, 10 minutes in a lesson. But again, you're using an authentic text, perhaps a piece of poetry, and students then can just crack on and just show you what they know by speaking beautifully, applying those phoneme sounds that you've developed with them. So speaking, we could have a little chorus when you're doing the register. Instead of doing a number or a piece of vocabulary, they could obviously just call out a sound, a key sound, their favourite sound, one that they perhaps need to practice. Just a small thing, but it's just making sure that they are using those phoneme sounds. Phoneme bingo, again, we can call these out, and rather like Blockbusters 2, the sounds, and they have to call them out, and they work their way across the board or collect 9 of them and then win a game. A writing activity then here, pick 3, 5 or 10 words that they, and with the same sound, for example, and get them. You can then, once they've developed their 3, 5 words, or whether you collate these words, again, if it's the wa sound or it's the o sound, you can create a list of them and then encourage students to write their best sentence. Now, this is their best sentence with at least 3, 5, 10 or even more words, but it has to be a sentence that makes sense. And in the act of doing that, it's very creative and it's really good fun. They're also practicing writing, those sound spelling links, but also they're creating a kind of tongue twister. And that tongue twister can easily be used by you, projected in a lesson, once you've corrected it, of course, because it's always good to keep an eye to make sure they are correct. And then you've just got a really simple starter activity. Students come in, settle down, you can project it on the board, they can just practice that, and then you'll ask 5 of them to perhaps speak it out loud. It's a really nice fun way, and students feel really excited and really, really empowered that they their tongue twister or their best sentence, because they don't always realize it's a tongue twister, is being used by the class. And they're wonderful as well, really wonderful. And of course, any poetry, raps or songs with key sounds, you can get them to rhyme. It's quite difficult in the target language, but students could still do this, and it's a really nice activity. So if you want to recall, retrieve and retrieve, there's physical activities as well, songs and dance moves. People know various songs because of various dance moves from the 70s, 80s, 90s. So why not do a similar thing? Why not take them out of the classroom if you have the space to do that, and if it's appropriate and safe, and encourage them to do physical phonics. And Sue Cave is a really inspirational person to get students to do physical movements with phonic sounds, to really embed that. I once visited a school in Barnsley here in the UK, and this school actually focused on the literacy within English, and they were teaching their learners target phonics through basketball. And what they did was the student teacher or TA would hold up a sound, and then if the students got that correctly, then they would pick up the basketball and just shoot through the hoop. So that's a really nice, fun way and physical way of doing something that actually is really important recall and learning. You could also apply this with football. You could hold up a flashcard with the sound on, and students have to say it or say a series of words. You can also do it with hopscotch too. There was a lovely poesy competition run by a gentleman called Jérôme Nogue, where he collated some French, German and Spanish poems and actually encouraged students in a global competition. I think there's about 30 countries involved, who encourage learners to just practice reciting these beautiful poems, and it was absolutely wonderful. I was a judge, and it was just such a pleasure to be involved. So doing something like that is really good fun too. And the British Council did an Express Yourself in Lockdown, again with their favourite poem, or indeed creating their own poem in the target language, and it just encouraged people to speak it, so they had to know it off by heart, and again they had to pause in the right places. So it was really nice for learners to be able to do. Again, creativity, if we look there, we've got best sentences, which end up being tongue twisters, and we could encourage students to create song lyrics, their own song lyrics, poetry and raps. Now that's up to you if you want to do that. And there are 2 things I want to share with you today. If you're looking at ICT, there's iLanguages, and this is a series of PowerPoints created, and it's all the phonic sounds within PowerPoints. And again, they've got tongue twisters, they've got PowerPoint slides, I think they're wonderful. They're very simple. They can be used at Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4. They're a little bit babyish, I would say personally, but it's entirely up to you. Check them out. I think they're brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And Sanico Live is a product which there's a 2-minute video attached to the link with this, but I don't think we've got time to show it now. But if you contact Sanico, and actually if you watch the video first, it's you can take any text and drop it in to their program, Pronounce Live. And basically, so it could be something from Le Monde, it could be something from a German newspaper, a Spanish newspaper, a text from a textbook, and just put one sentence in. You drop it in, and what happens is if you're a fluent French or German or Spanish, Italian, it's got about 144 languages you can do this in, speaks that perfectly, word and sound perfect, and it's not robotic. It's really beautiful sound, and students then can listen to it multiple times, but then they have to repeat it. And actually, in the process of repeating it, they then get an immediate score, whether they're 40, 30, 100% correct. And it's a really powerful tool to really get students to practice their pronunciation. Now, at the end of this presentation, David Binns, the CEO of Sanico UK, has very kindly given me permission to give you all schools in the British schools in the Middle East. Please do reach out to him, get in touch, say I told you to get in touch if you want to, and hopefully he'll set you up with a free trial, because it is a truly wonderful, inspirational tool. It's fantastic. So the impacts of teaching phonics is right there. If students can break down the words into smaller parts and sound it out, combining a range of sounds together and blending them so they can say the whole word correctly, they're going to start feeling really positive. They're going to start making that progress. They're going to start integrating a wider range of vocabulary. In terms of target language phonics and the impact across the 4 skills, you can see it right there. Listening, speaking, reading, writing. You might want to pause the video to go through them all. What I would say to you, this has happened in my classroom and with schools that I've worked with, which is really powerful, really, really powerful. And you might even be able to think of some more. What I will say is, if you do have native speakers in your classroom, do take the extra time. So the sound spelling issue for native speakers, especially when writing isn't encouraged, that can be a real problem. But as their teacher, you probably already know that about your students. So you might want to stop the video now if you're working in your departments, or if indeed you're sat and just taking a moment to go through this and think about phonics and think about teaching, and just identify elements of these 2 questions. So what do you do well in your team, your classroom, your department, and what do you need to be able, what do you need now to enable and ensure phonics teaching is a feature and a proper embedded feature in your classroom, not just a tick box, yes, I've done it, Krista, move on, because it needs to be a golden thread that's interwoven throughout your lessons, your curriculum, your schemes of learning. And then obviously, how often is this visited and revisited and recalled? Because we are shaping learners of all kinds, and learners learn differently. So if you just focus on the listening activities I've shared with you, then actually that might not help some of them. We know that if students do really focus on phonics, really focus on that level of development, then it does help their listening. Instead of that long string of words, it breaks it down. So don't just focus on the listening, or don't just assume that target language phonics only helps speaking, because it also helps students to identify and take apart a dense text. It really helps them to identify the beginning and ends of words. It really helps them do an awful lot, including feel more confident within the target language in your classroom, but also just make sure that you create lots of opportunities, not immediately. Remember, Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, across a period of time, and it doesn't have to be for the remainder of this academic year. It should be next academic year, and then the year following that as well. The way we recall and retrieve it, and the many different ways, and I've only shared with you a few, I'm sure you can think of more, then learners will get it and they'll be able to apply it and use it. So what's your main takeaway from today? And if you've got any questions, please do email them to Claire, and I'm sure that she'll collate them and email across to me, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. And if you're interested in any further reading and some of the things that I've used and I've referred to throughout my career, is certainly the Framework for Languages, the Pedagogy Review, but also looking at the Education Endowment Foundation's toolkit. Now that's for English and teaching English, or certainly first language, but it's quite an interesting read. I've written a book, Independent Thinking on MFL. There's quite a lot in there in phonics. Feel free to have a little look at that if you want to. There's Robert Waugh's thesis there about thinking aloud and language 2 decoding and exploration of strategies, and that's a really powerful document. I really like that one. The Sanako pronounced with David Binns's email address there, and Les Planètes Phoniques, which is the iLanguages presentation that I wanted to share with you, and I will send it with Claire, so there will be something to go along with this. I can highly recommend the work of Claire Seckham and Sue Cave, and certainly if you've been based in the UK quite recently, you'll know that NSUP, which are the National Centres for Excellence in Languages Pedagogy, which were set up as a result of the Pedagogy Review 2016. Rachel Hawkes and Professor Emma Marsden are co-directors within that, and they've been doing a lot of work on phonics and phonics pedagogy. And obviously there's Rachel Hawkes's website too. So all of those resources pretty much are free. And I'd just like to say thank you so very much for inviting me today to speak to all of you, the British schools of the Middle East. It's been wonderful from my end. Like I say, if you do have any questions, please do email me either directly or send them to Claire, and Claire can obviously collate those and send them across to me. If I can help you in any way with any with any languages pedagogy, please do reach out. There's my Twitter handle there and also my email address. And it has been really wonderful to record this session for you today. Wishing you all well in the languages journey.
Well, hello everybody. My name is Michael Jamin, sounds better in English. I'm head of Modern Foreign Language Department at Dubai English Speaking School, and I teach French there. So the title of my presentation today is there a place for phonics in the teaching of MFL? I would like to share some strategies and some reflections. Now, a lot of languages have phonetic writing, which means that you write it as it is pronounced. The case of Turkish, for instance, Spanish, Arabic. But in English and French, which is my case, we are faced with this kind of problems. I'm sure you've seen this.
Blood, sang, without, sang, 100, sang. Smells, sang, without 100 smells of blood. Sang, 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 sang.
Sang, 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 sang.
Faith.
So I'm going to start with a disclaimer before I share the aims of today. First of all, I'm not an authority and you can disagree. Now, although I have an academic background and I've been teaching for quite a number of years, I'm really interested into sharing what my strategies are and what's been my journey. I'm also interested into sharing with you what second language acquisition, or SLA, tells us about how we should be in the classroom, how we should teach language learning and reading, and then how that has influenced my strategies. Hopefully that will prompt you to do a little action research yourself at the end, and I have ways to suggest how to go about it. So the first thing we need to agree on is the definition of phonics and the teaching of phonics. Phonics is the relationship between a phoneme and its grapheme, so the sound and the graphic representation of the sound. So we're not here going to talk about phonetics and using phonetic science, but the teaching of each letter, basically. And how does that apply to MFL? And here the debate is, do we teach it discretely as a separate part of a lesson, or do we teach it organically and assuming that the children are going to make the relationship themselves when they hear the sound and see the word? As you've seen in my little resume, I come from an academic background. I used to teach in university, and I'm a bit of a linguistic and grammar buff. I love phonology, the grammar of sounds, I love phonetics, and I love a good grammar rule. So basically, to improve the reading of my students, I did what I thought worked well in English. I taught phonics, and usually I used to teach that as a starter of each lesson. So I devised this beautiful grid with the first of the basic sounds on the left, a, e, I, o, u, then we go into nasals, on, and all the sounds that sound the same, all the grapheme that sound the same, I would put together into a box and make my way through basically that little grid there, all those little grids. And I was assuming that children would integrate that and apply that in their reading. Did it work? No, it did not work. After a whole year of phonics starters, I was still getting things like je peux aller aux toilettes, je suis très content, which was very frustrating. But listening to very influential people in the research in the field of second language acquisition, I realized that this was a typical case of teacher projection. And what the researchers were telling me is that most people actually don't like grammar, and most people don't find language learning easy. The people who do like grammar end up as language teachers. But 95% of students don't end up as language teachers. So I came across, through a lot of research in SLA, second language acquisition, I came across two professors, Stephen Krashen, first of all, and Bill Van Patten, which basically advocated a more natural approach for second language acquisition. And reading more and more about this approach made me make a complete U-turn on how I see language acquisition, how I see the teaching of French, for instance, and languages in general. So without delving too deep into those guys' theories, the first thing to retain is the distinction introduced by Krashen between the difference between learning a language and acquiring a language. And for Krashen, we don't learn languages, we acquire them. Acquiring the acquisition is an unconscious process, and it happens when we understand the meaning of a message. It happens when we match meaning with form, and when the input of the teacher is comprehensible. So the role of the teacher for Krashen is to provide enough comprehensible input for the student to build up his own or her own representation of the language. And Bill Van Patten agrees with that. For him, language is an abstract mental representation that builds over time, and it's just basically words get into relationships with one another, and this is actually individual to each learner. For Van Patten, there is no grammar rules as we understand them traditionally, but more relationships between words and morphemes. I'll go into that a little bit later. For Van Patten, there is also a natural order of acquisition. So the two agree on that. And for Van Patten, we learn big words first. So for instance, we would learn nouns and verbs and adjectives first before we go into preposition. This has consequences for us as teachers. Don't teach prepositions to beginners, for instance, or don't actually pay attention too much on the preposition because children or students are not ready. What he also said through his research is that correction is not effective and it just means when the students make mistakes, it just means that the student is not sensitive to that rule or pattern yet, and that they're focusing on other bigger, more important things when they're talking. But basically, what Krashen and Van Patten have in common is that they advocate that language is too complicated to be taught in vocabulary and rules, and expect students to put these rules together and speak or read. So it's a bit like having parts of a dismantled plane and being expected to put it together and fly it. Too much is happening at the same time. Let's give you an example. If you consider the sentence "Tu aimes beaucoup les biscuits," which for non-French speakers mean you like biscuits a lot. When you read this, or when you hear it, or when you have to speak it, when you have to say it, you need to think about, first of all, the basic meaning, the message that you want to come across. Then again, you have to think about the syntactic order of the words in the utterance, how you're going to put them together. For instance, beaucoup, a lot, in French comes after the verb, but in English you can't say you like a lot biscuits. So the syntactic order is important. You also need to think about the morphosyntax, or the verb inflections, or the female marks for adjectives, for instance. So you are going to need to think, right, I said tu aimes beaucoup les biscuits, not tu aimais or tu aimons les biscuits. You have to think about the pronunciation. When you read of the S at the end of M, you have to make that silent. The P at the end of beaucoup is silent. The S and the T at the end of biscuit is silent. So all of this is very important to know. You also need to think about the intonation. Is it a statement or a question? For instance, tu aimes beaucoup les biscuits is a statement. Tu aimes beaucoup les biscuits is a question. Or tu aimes beaucoup les biscuits is probably sarcasm. Then again, we have to think about the pragmatic context. Is it okay to say tu aimes beaucoup les biscuits to an obese person, for instance? So a lot of these things are have a bit to be taken into account at the same time. So for Krashen and Van Patten, you cannot break down all the rules and expect students to put them all together. It's just too many things that are happening at the same time. What teachers need to understand and get their children to do is to build a mental representation of the relationships between the words and the morphemes, or prefix and suffixes, for instance, because there are no explicit grammar rules, but unconscious relationships of acceptable, not acceptable. So if you consider example number 1, did he enjoyed it? I'm sure you've heard some foreign speakers say that. Well, that's quite a simple rule to explain as a traditional grammar thing. You can say, well, you can't have double past tense markers. You can't have did and enjoyed at the same time in one sentence. Easy done. But when you think about example number 2, I reapplied, that's acceptable, but I re-slept, that's not acceptable. Or I enjoy running is okay, but I enjoy to run is not okay. What's the rule then? What native speakers have is a sense of what is acceptable or not. Are these words okay together and in that order, or they're not okay together or not in that order? So what does that mean for us teachers? What are the consequences? What should we do? And coming back to reading and phonics, how does that apply to reading? Should we teach phonics? Well, I would argue that yes and no. It depends if your children are non-readers or if your children are readers. But whatever you have in front of you in the classroom, the ideas I'm going to share, I hope will accelerate the learning. So I will share my experience and transform that in a series of advice. And my advice number 1 is don't overcomplicate. On the right hand side, this is what I started with when I was teaching phonics. I had, first of all, on the left, the vowels a, e, o, u in French. Then we're going to nasals and on, and all the in a line, all the nasals that have the same sounds, ya, etc. And I would go through each box, and one lesson would be one box, and we would do flashcards, and it would basically not work really well. What worked a little bit better with some non-readers I had was to completely go back to basics and really go simple. So go through on the left hand side, the left square, going through the letter sounds like you're doing phonics, and then highlight the sounds that are never pronounced in French, like the H and the X, and then go into specific graphemes, which are, but not go into big details as you would see on the right hand side. Because again, children don't have the possibility to put all these rules together. And of course, I would link all these sounds and graphemes to real words, but I think that would be preaching to the choir. Now, my advice number 2 is to reverse the problem. It's actually to use the meaning first. So the idea is to teach anchor words, and these anchor words will be learned through gestures, and for that this is inspired from TPR, Total Physical Response, which is another sort of natural approach movement from the 70s, 80s. And what we are trying to create here is to really quickly create relationships between meaning and sound. For that you can use high frequency verbs, and I'll show you what I use, or you can use colors and numbers. What I mean by anchor words is like words of reference that you can go back to. Do you remember this word? Bang, same sound here. And the power of these words is that they always come back, so use high frequency vocabulary. What's important is to focus on the meaning and trust the brain to do the segmentation, the blending. It will happen organically. So at the same time of teaching colors and numbers, I very quickly teach children, readers especially, the sweet 16 verbs. I didn't invent that. This is quite a known thing in the comprehensible input movement. So you teach those sweet 16 verbs. They are different in all languages, but for French they're easy to find on the internet. And you associate a gesture to each of them. Then you obviously play this little grid there, and then you can place down it says children love it, and you insist on children getting the gesture right. The gesture is very important for retention. You can then just do little grammar points like, oh, can you see the peut, c'est, dit, veut, pas? All these T's are silent, right guys? And that's your grammar rule. And obviously once you've introduced the Sweet 16, you can build up on that vocabulary. I also use some highlighting sometimes to highlight the consonants that are not pronounced, and take away that highlighting once the children are producing good reading. So once you've got your anchor words, my third advice would be to give 5-second sound grapheme timeouts, or what I call 5-second grammar rules. And if you have, for instance, Marie et Paul veulent un sandwich, which means Marie and Paul want a sandwich, I would just say, hey kids, it's the they verb ending, so we don't pronounce the ENT. Remember, we saw that rule before, and then you just regularly repeat that, but very, very short. Again, the focus is on the message and the meaning, and assume children will integrate that in time. My advice number 4 is not to make a big thing about mistakes. And actually Bill Van Patten shows that it might be ineffective or even counter-effective to correct children, and necessarily to correct them too much. The reason for that is that learners might not be sensitive to that mistake. They might be on a lower level, and you're trying to basically correct mistakes at a higher level where they're not ready to acquire. So you have to trust the learner to integrate the mistake that they're making, to integrate the correct sound organically through time. And the learner will do that if enough quantity of comprehensible input is given. I'm going to show you an example of how long correction take and how sometimes ineffective they are. So this is an example of Year 4 reading I gave in January 2020. That was the first sort of recording of reading that I got from my Year 4s after seeing all that vocabulary and story. And I would like you to focus on the pronunciation of est que, which means yes or no in French, and also of he, which means ho. I also want you to focus on how this child says which means is, and you will see that she says est or It's kind of like she's the rule is not secure yet in her head. She says est most of the time.
Est-ce que il y a un garçon? Oui, il y a un garçon. Is there a boy? Yes, there is a boy. Qui est le garçon? Le garçon est George. Who is the boy? The boy is George. Est-ce que George est un garçon? Où est George? Oui, George est un garçon. Is George a boy? Yes, George is a boy. Est-ce que George est une pizza? No, George est un garçon. Is George a pizza? No, George is a boy. Qui est George?
This is what I fed back to her, and we use seesaw in our school, and this is my recording. I do apologize for the bad English. I was a bit tired that day.
Well done, Zena. You got really very secure accent, and your comprehension is spot on. Two sounds I want you to work on. You seem to say est-ce que il y a. You don't have to say the second que. Just say est-ce que il y a. Est-ce qu'il y a? Est-ce qu'il y a un garçon? The second sound I want you to work on is who. Qui est le garçon? It's not que or qui or que. It's qui. Qui est le garçon? The rest is spot on.
So I didn't pick her up on the fact that she's saying est instead of but I pick her up on the fact that she's mispronouncing the question word est que and he. This is how she self-corrects in February, a month after the first reading.
Est-ce que il y a un garçon? Oui, il y a un garçon. Qui est le garçon? Le garçon est Mr. Bean. Est-ce que Mr. Bean est un grand garçon? Oui, Mr. Bean est un grand garçon. Est-ce que Mr. Bean est un girafe? Non, Mr. Bean est un garçon.
As you can see, there is absolutely no correction whatsoever on this between est que il y a, and there is still est que il y a. The key is still not right, and there's a variation between and est. And then when you're looking at her last recording in March, I unfortunately don't have the est que question in that text, but look at the pronunciation of there is a realization moment where she monitors, she is sensitive to the rule now, and she self-corrects. So the rest of the est have actually she says them correctly.
Où est Fred les champs? Where is Fred the cat? Fred les champs est en France à Paris. Fred the cat is in France, in Paris. Il est content. He is happy. Pourquoi? Why? Il n'est pas de problème. Il a une pizza. Because he has no problem. He has a pizza. Où est Mr. Bean? Where is Mr. Bean? Monsieur Bean est en Ireland à Dublin. Mr. Bean is in Ireland, in Dublin. Il n'est pas content. He is not happy.
Right, my advice number 6 is to improve reading through hearing and interacting stories. And for this, the best tool at your disposal is Blaine Ray's TPRS. And TPRS stands for Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling. Basically, the teachers animates and interacts with the children, and the children and the teacher build up a story together. And it's based on high frequency vocabulary and high frequency verbs. I'll show you a typical slide right now. So the TPRS book's stories are very simple. The slide looks like this. The top and bottom are question words, and then you work as a teacher on one sentence at a time. You ask questions once you've done your statement and the children react to the statement. You then ask who questions, is there yes or no questions, where is questions, how many questions, and the children respond. You then, that's called circling. After that you do individual questions, that goes triangling, and it's quite a complex procedure. It takes about two to 3 days to be trained in this method, but I highly recommend it. What I do is, once the children have listened to the story or to the slide, I give it to read to the children, and I model the reading as a seesaw exercise. I send it, and then they have to read it as well, and basically send me an example of their reading. The sample of the recording of the child I got you to listen earlier on is actually the reading of this story plus a story used with Mr. Bean using the same vocabulary. And you can see the level that you get is quite phenomenal for Year 4. Now, as you can see in TPRS, everything is translated because this is the quickest way to get comprehensible inputs. You can point at the English where you say the French, for instance. But it prevents you from speaking any English in the class while you're doing the story. So TPRS being Teaching Proficiency Through Storytelling and Reading. My advice number 7 is to improve reading through reading. And what I advise you to do is to develop your own stories using the same vocabulary but with different characters and varying the story slightly. So you provide lots and lots of comprehensible input. And as you model all the reading, the learner integrates the phonic rules over time and with the sheer quantity of comprehensible inputs. Just to give you an example of one of the slides of the story, and you can get a sense of the repetition. I've highlighted all the words that I really repeat and I really hammer in. So the verb to have, the cat, the verb to be, the expression there is, all of these are repeated and repeated and repeated until the child gets the rule. And over time, through your Sweet 16 verbs or colors or number starters, I use the Sweet 16 verbs a lot. you can develop the children's vocabulary as well as the sounds. So in this story of Mr. Bean, which comes subsequently to the cat story, Mr. Bean goes to the zoo, and here I use nearly all the Sweet 16 within that story. The words that are new, I put in blue as part of the glossary, and I like to highlight the verbs because children know that's the center of the sentence. Now, if you do not want to develop your own stories, there are some stories out there. TPRS books are one example, but there's also other sites that provide leveled readers. But that's the next step, and I would say that's for more advanced learners. For primary school, I don't think children would get to that level unless they are bilingual or semi-bilingual. But they're out there, and that's the next step for the learners. Again, reading. Improving reading through reading. Right, I've been talking for quite a while now, so to summarize what I wanted to say is that I would personally not teach phonics discreetly unless I'm faced with non-readers. If I had non-readers in front of me, I would try to start slowly and not overcomplicate it. But for readers, I find it more efficient to use anchor words, especially verbs, and to focus in my lessons on meaning. The sound comes with time, and the children actually get it right. If there is a silent sound, for instance, or specific sounds, I just point at it in a 5-second timeout, and again, I don't make a big thing out of it. I don't tend to correct my children that much because they are not ready to hear that corrections if they're making that mistakes. I point at it sometimes, but I don't make a big thing out of it. And what I found the most efficient to teach reading is actually reading. So I use stories, I interact stories, and I give them to read at home as well. And that's the most efficient way to teach reading. But I obviously don't expect you to take my word for it. I am no expert, I'm just a practitioner, so I really encourage you to experiment. And as a way forward to action research, I would have within the same year group a traditional class where you teach phonics starters, you teach the rules, you correct everything they do, and then have a different class where you use a comprehensible input approach and that you teach through anchor words and through reading with little or no correction. See what happens, see for yourselves. Hopefully this has, even if you don't agree with me, this has stimulated your interest. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in contact with me through the BSME.
Thank you so much to our two speakers, Krista and Mikhail, for joining us for today's webinar. And just a quick reminder that if you have any questions for either of our speakers today, please post them on the MFL network page and I will forward them to the relevant speaker. Responses will be posted once received. As BSME members, you are also eligible to watch the webinars in any of the networks, including Teaching and Learning, Leadership Matters and Safeguarding. And a reminder that you can engage with us on the discussion forums on the MFL network page. Similarly, if you have any network-specific resources you'd like to share, please load them into the Sharing Resources forum. A final thank you from me to our speakers, Krista Hazel and Mikhail Jamin, and to you for watching today. And I do hope that you will join us again for our next and final webinar for this academic year on Thursday, the 17th of June, on the theme of effective languages provision and transition from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. Thank you so much.